February 20th, 1944, over central Germany. At 26,000 feet, 7,900 nautical, contrails stretched across a pale winter sky as the first wave of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts crossed the Rhine. Below them lay the cities of Gotha, Leipzig, and Brunswick, names that would soon define the destruction of the Luftwaffe's industrial heart. Captain Robert Welch glanced at his fuel gauges. His flight of 6 Mustangs had already climbed beyond the planned escort altitude for the B-17 formations trailing 10 miles, 16 kilometers, behind. "Maintain heading," came the voice of Major Don Gentile over the radio, calm and deliberate. "We're hunting today." Hunting, not escorting. It was the first day the 8th Air Force operated under General James H. Doolittle's new directive: abandon the bombers once they reached enemy airspace and attack German fighters wherever they formed. To many commanders, the order bordered on madness. Fighter escort doctrine demanded tight protection. Doolittle's reversal seemed reckless, an invitation to chaos. Yet from his headquarters at High Wycombe, the 67-kilogram engineer-turned-airman had made his decision with surgical logic. Destroying the Luftwaffe meant destroying its pilots, not merely its planes. The bombers were bait. The fighters, the real target. Through thin cirrus clouds, Welch saw the first specks of silver ahead, Me-109s climbing in pairs, sunlight flashing off their wings. The Germans were taking the bait, rising to meet the bombers that were no longer there. The Mustangs broke formation and dived, guns armed, each pilot free to attack at will. For the Luftwaffe, this moment shattered 2 years of tactical confidence. Their controllers at Gießen and Kassel watched radar screens dissolve into confusion. American fighters were everywhere, above, behind, miles from the bombers they were supposed to guard. The neat geometry of interception unraveled. Over Oschersleben, one staffel of FW-190s was wiped out in 3 minutes. Near Braunschweig, a group of Ma-110 twin-engine interceptors was caught climbing and annihilated before reaching altitude. Gun camera film from that day showed German formations disintegrating under fire, engines streaming smoke against the winter haze. The new tactic looked suicidal, yet it worked with mechanical precision. Freed from escort constraints, the Mustangs could exploit their speed and range, attacking refueling bases, assembly airfields, and stragglers returning to land. By nightfall, more than 260 German aircraft had been destroyed or written off, the highest single-day loss since the Battle of Britain. In London, the press would call it Big Week. Inside the Luftwaffe's command network, it became something else entirely, a signal that their system had been broken by a man many of them had never heard of. What appeared reckless was, in truth, a deliberate experiment in psychological and strategic annihilation, conceived by a general once dismissed as a showman and gambler. But before the world could understand his logic, it had to understand how the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies and why Doolittle's audacity was the only answer that could end it. In early 1944, the Allied air war over Europe had reached a mathematical impasse. Every week, hundreds of American bombers crossed into German airspace, and every week, dozens failed to return. The statistics told a story of unsustainable attrition. Between August 1943 and January 1944, the 8th Air Force had lost 1,564 heavy bombers, nearly 1 in 4 dispatched. Each loss meant 10 trained crewmen, $1 million in aircraft, and 1,000 hours of training erased in minutes of fire and falling aluminum. The Luftwaffe's defensive system, built on radar-directed fighter control, was performing with ruthless efficiency. From occupied France to the Ruhr, an invisible lattice of radar beams, observation posts, and radio networks guided interceptors to their prey. German fighter units, Jägerschwader 1, 3, 11, 26, and 54, were masters of timing and concentration. The moment bomber streams entered the radar grid, staffels of BF-109s and FW-190s rose in coordinated waves, each one aiming for the vulnerable center of the American formations. At 25,000 feet, 7,600 Mellers, combat was fought in minutes but planned in hours. Luftwaffe controllers orchestrated interception arcs with precision that seemed mechanical. The Americans called it the defense in depth. The Germans called it Gefechtsführung, battle leadership by radio. For months, the U.S. Army Air Forces had tried to solve the problem with technology rather than doctrine. They introduced the long-range P-47 Thunderbolt, then the twin-engine P-38 Lightning, and finally the sleek P-51 Mustang. Each promised the missing ingredient, range to Berlin and back, but none changed the pattern of defeat. Even when fighters reached the bombers, they were bound by a single principle: never leave the formation. The results were predictable. German pilots ignored the escorts, dove straight into the bomber streams, and turned the sky into a furnace. On October 14, 1943, known forever as Black Thursday, 291 B-17s of the 1st and 3rd Bombardment Divisions flew against the Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants. 60 were shot down, 600 airmen killed or captured. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, called the loss a near disaster. Into this crisis stepped James Harold Doolittle. He was no stranger to risk. Born in Alameda, California in 1896, he had been an engineer before a pilot, a man who measured danger in equations, not instincts. He had won the Schneider Trophy for air racing in 1925, completed the first blind flight in history in 1929, and had led the audacious Tokyo raid in 1942. Among his peers, Doolittle's name meant brilliance and trouble in equal measure. When he took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, morale was brittle, confidence fractured. His first act was to walk into the operations room at High Wycombe and tell his weary staff, "We're not going to lose this war because we're predictable." His analysis was cold and unforgiving. The Luftwaffe's strength was not its aircraft. It was its organization. Each German fighter base functioned as a cog in a centralized machine. If American bombers were the targets, their defenders would always have initiative. To reverse the equation, Doolittle had to make the Luftwaffe fight on his terms. He proposed a fundamental inversion of Allied air doctrine. Instead of guarding bombers like sheepdogs, American fighters would become predators. Their objective would not be protection, but destruction. Seek out German fighters, attack them on takeoff, landing, or anywhere they gathered. Bombers would remain bait, but the kill would belong to the hunters. When Doolittle briefed his group commanders in early February, silence filled the room. One colonel later recalled, "He might as well have said we'd abandon the bombers altogether." It sounded insane. Critics in London called it the Doolittle gamble, an echo of his reputation for audacity. But Doolittle's reasoning was unshakable. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than it could train them. Each German ace shot down represented a loss far greater than a machine. "Destroy the pilot corps," Doolittle told his staff, "and the Reich's air power dies with it." To make the plan work, he needed discipline, numbers, and a technological edge. The first came from rigorous coordination. Every Mustang squadron trained to fight independently, guided by radio control centers, tracking combat in real time. The second came from sheer American production, thousands of P-51Ds flowing from North American aviation's lines in California and Texas. The third was invisible: fuel. British refineries had finally begun supplying 150-octane aviation gasoline, raising the Merlin engine's output from 1,490 to 1,720 horsepower at combat boost. The difference was decisive. Where the German Daimler-Benz engines began starving at altitude, the Mustangs now climbed and dove like no piston fighter before them. On paper, Doolittle's transformation looked technical. In practice, it was revolutionary. It demanded that pilots abandon the instinct to protect and instead embrace the calculus of annihilation. The first full test would come within days, an operation so vast that even the Germans could hardly believe it real. It would be called Operation Argument, though history would remember it by another name, Big Week. The sky over Germany was about to become a laboratory for Doolittle's dangerous mathematics, where the cost of every decision would be measured not in theory, but in fire. The plan took form not in a burst of inspiration, but through the cold arithmetic of attrition. By January 1944, Allied intelligence estimated the Luftwaffe had fewer than 2,500 operational fighters in Western Europe. Yet those aircraft were supported by a structure of more than 400 airfields, radar stations, and maintenance depots, each a node in an interlocking defense system. Destroying factories could slow production, but it would not stop the defenders. The real vulnerability lay in the pilots themselves. Doolittle's engineers calculated that Germany was graduating only 250 new fighter pilots per month, down from 1,000 in 1942. The attrition rate, meanwhile, had doubled. If the 8th Air Force could destroy even half that number monthly, the Luftwaffe would bleed to death before summer. It was a strategy of exhaustion, not conquest, scientific extermination applied to air power. To many in the U.S. Army Air Forces, the concept violated sacred doctrine. Since 1942, escort fighters had been ordered to remain within sight of bomber formations, flying close cover to deter interceptors. Their duty was defense, not initiative. Doolittle reversed it overnight. "Your job," he told his fighter group commanders, "is to kill Germans, not to babysit bombers." The words spread through squadrons like electricity, half inspiration, half heresy. Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, a former Eagle Squadron veteran, embraced the new doctrine immediately. "About time," he told his men. "We've been waiting 2 years for permission to fight the way we were trained." Others were less enthusiastic. Some commanders feared chaos, the disintegration of formation discipline, the risk of bombers left defenseless. But Doolittle's confidence was absolute. He believed freedom of action would multiply lethality through initiative. Each pilot, equipped with radio direction-finding gear and trained in vectoring procedures, could hunt independently while remaining part of a vast aerial network. It was the airborne equivalent of swarm tactics, distributed intelligence replacing rigid command. In early February 1944, at Bassingbourn and Debden airfields, Mustangs were repainted in bare aluminum, shedding camouflage to save weight and reflect heat at high altitude. Armorers recalibrated Browning .50 caliber guns for longer bursts, 800 rounds per minute each, 4,800 per second for the full 6-gun battery. Crews drilled on rapid refueling and rearming cycles, reducing turnaround time from 90 to 45 minutes. Every detail pointed to a new rhythm of combat, sustained offense instead of reactive defense. The shift extended to training. Doolittle personally observed exercises over the English Channel, watching pairs of Mustangs dive and climb in vertical engagements at 500 km/h. He stressed altitude discipline, speed preservation, and coordination by radio, principles borrowed from the Navy's energy-fighting doctrine that had proven lethal in the Pacific. "Speed is life," he told the pilots. "Altitude is insurance. Waste neither." The psychological resistance came from higher up. British Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory warned that freeing the escorts might expose bomber streams to annihilation. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command, dismissed the idea as Doolittle's cowboy war. Even within the U.S. ranks, some saw the plan as a dangerous gamble driven by ego. But Doolittle had data. Radar analysis showed that Luftwaffe fighter strength clustered near aircraft assembly plants in central Germany, Regensburg, Augsburg, Gotha, and Schweinfurt. If American fighters roamed these areas, they would not only destroy interceptors, but also disrupt maintenance and logistics. For the first time, the Luftwaffe would be forced to fight everywhere at once. On February 8th, he convened a final briefing at High Wycombe. On the wall hung a massive map of Europe covered with red strings tracing bomber routes and blue markers for escort zones. Doolittle picked up a wax pencil and drew a wide arc deep into Germany, far beyond previous escort limits. "From here," he said, tapping near Brunswick, "you are free. No fixed altitude, no fixed formation. Find them, kill them, bring them home." The silence that followed was broken only by the scratching of pencils recording the new orders. Some officers exchanged wary glances. Others smiled in anticipation. In that moment, doctrine turned to revolution. Across the airfields of East Anglia, the new policy spread with the efficiency of an industrial directive. Ground crews painted mission codes on cowls, refilled oxygen bottles, checked drop tanks. Pilots studied maps marked with Luftwaffe airfields, Verneuchen, Reuchlin, Stendal, and Kassel. The enemy's front door was open, and Doolittle intended to walk through it. A week later, Operation Argument began. The bombers would strike the aircraft industry, but the real assault would come from the fighters unleashed ahead of them. No more tight escorts, no more predictable patterns. Just waves of Mustangs and Thunderbolts diving into German airspace like predators smelling blood. The revolution was invisible from the ground, but its impact would soon register in every German radar station and every pilot's logbook. The age of defensive warfare in the air was ending. What replaced it was pure offense, fast, disciplined, and utterly without mercy. And as the first missions roared skyward from the frozen airfields of England, the world would soon see whether Doolittle's audacity was tactical genius or the madness that would break the 8th Air Force forever. Dawn on February 20th broke cold and precise across East Anglia. Squadrons taxied into the thin light, their engines coughing into life as ground crews completed final checks. Pilots strapped in with the same rituals practiced for years, yet the orders they carried had been rewritten overnight. Today, they would not cling to bomber boxes. They would cut loose and hunt. The bomber streams climbed on predictable tracks, heavy silhouettes climbing toward Reich territory like distant, slow islands in an ocean of blue. Fighter squadrons rose with them, but the escorts did not cling to the limps of aluminium. Instead, they climbed higher, peeled outward, and expanded their patrol footprint into an arc that reached tens of kilometers beyond previous limits. The new geometry converted predictable corridors into lethal trap fields. Contact came faster than expected. Radar nodes at Jever and Hanover reported dots scattering as fighters abandoned formation discipline to intercept. German controllers watched on screens as American fighters appeared where no escort should have been, then vanished into cloud layers and reappeared over airfields. The pattern resembled an ambush more than routine protection, and it unnerved experienced controller officers. The first dogfights under Doolittle's orders were brutal and brief. When flight leader Captain Robert Welch sighted a line of Bf-109s climbing to meet what they believed were unguarded bombers, he called his element and dove. The Mustang's laminar flow wing and Merlin engine acceleration gave him a decisive energy advantage. Short, controlled bursts from six 50 caliber guns shattered radiators and severed tailplanes. In less than 5 minutes, what had been a tight German staffel became scattered wreckage and burning metal. Reports from German units used language that suggested disbelief. An intelligence memo from the 2nd Jagdkorps described the American fighters' behavior as unorthodox, almost reckless, noting commanders' confusion at being engaged far from bomber lanes. Field reports recorded by Luftwaffe staffers repeated a word that would spread among officers: kamikaze, not because pilots intentionally died, but because the Americans fought without the conservative caution that had structured air combat since 1940. On the ground, the effect was immediate. Airfields that had seemed safe in prior months found runways crisscrossed with fires. Fuel trucks smashed and parked aircraft strafed while crews scrambled. At Lechfeld and Verneuchen, mechanics counted repairable airframes and cursed the new pattern. Fuel lines were severed by strafing passes. Maintenance tents burned. The Americans were not merely engaging fighters in the air. They were attacking the web that sustained those fighters. Within 72 hours of the first missions, cumulative German sortie rates dropped perceptibly. Fighters scrambled less often, and when they did, they appeared in smaller, fractured formations. The 8th Air Force's pilots exploited this fragmentation mercilessly. Mission logs from the period show multiple instances of 6 plane sections locating and destroying entire Gruppen as they attempted to assemble after takeoff. Coordination, long the Luftwaffe's strength, broke under distributed, relentless pressure. The human cost was stark. Experienced German pilots were disproportionately represented among the losses. A staffel leader killed on February 22nd had logged over 600 combat sorties. His replacement, a younger pilot with 60 hours of frontline time, assumed command under a cloud of exhaustion and equipment shortages. The Luftwaffe's training pipeline could not compensate. Attrition outpaced graduation. For American crews, the change felt both intoxicating and dangerous. Freed from the bomber's immediate shadow, pilots had to make rapid choices: when to engage, when to break contact, and how to navigate back to base with fuel margins eroded by aggressive maneuvering. Ground commanders instituted new discipline: maintain minimum fuel reserves, report position every 10 minutes, and never pursue beyond visual navigation range without a vector from control. Those rules saved lives and returned pilots to fight another day. Public perception shifted as well. Newspapers in London and New York ran dispatches describing fighter pilots who roamed free over Germany, a phrase that implied both danger and daring. In the Luftwaffe's secure channels, by contrast, the tone hardened into alarm. Intercepted German signals recorded by Allied intelligence contained terse orders: conserve fighters, prioritize protection of maintenance hubs, avoid pursuit into deep enemy country without support. The commanders were adapting reactive measures born of panic. By the close of Big Week's opening phase, the statistics were stark enough to prove the concept. The Luftwaffe had lost hundreds of aircraft across multiple days, while American fighter losses remained materially lower in proportion, a function of both tactics and logistics. Perhaps more significant than raw numbers was the qualitative change. German units stopped behaving like concentrated, centrally controlled formations and began operating like hunted flocks. Historians would later mark these first missions as the moment doctrine shifted irreversibly. The tactical chaos Doolittle had invited was not a collapse. It was controlled disorder, a new operational logic that traded short-term conventional safety for strategic destruction of the enemy's fighting corps. The shock it delivered to the Luftwaffe would ripple through their ranks for months. altering not only who flew, but how Germany thought about defending its skies. The early months of execution had answered the central question left by doctrine. Could dispersed, aggressive fighter action be sustained and coordinated at scale? The answer arrived in pilot debriefs, maintenance logs, and intercepted orders, and it pointed unambiguously toward a new form of aerial warfare. By the final days of February 1944, the chaos had begun to organize itself into doctrine. What had started as a risky experiment now evolved into a deliberate system of air control. Doolittle's reckless freedom was being shaped into something repeatable, mathematical, and devastating. The first step was standardization. Every squadron received revised tactical manuals titled Offensive Fighter Operations in Enemy Territory. The instructions were simple, yet revolutionary. Maintain energy, strike from altitude, disengage by speed, and never allow the enemy to choose the angle of combat. Each flight of 4 Mustangs formed the core unit, operating in pairs, leader and wingman, interlocked for protection, but capable of splitting instantly for attack. The geometry of engagement shifted from the horizontal plane to the vertical. American fighters began using dive-zoom-climb cycles, exploiting altitude as stored energy. A P-51 diving from 9,000 barrier reached 700 km/h before pulling up into a climb that left BF-109s and FW-190s stalling below. In 3 passes, an entire staffel could be broken apart without a turning fight. It was the same logic that had governed the Pacific's Hellcat tactics, transposed to the colder, higher skies of Europe. German observers struggled to decode the method. The old advantage of turning radius and low-speed agility was gone. Jagdgeschwader after-action reports described enemy aircraft that refuse battle in the horizontal and reappear from above with perfect timing. Luftwaffe engineers had once calculated that a Bf-109G could outturn any Allied fighter within 300 mt. Now that advantage was irrelevant. The fight no longer happened there. Radar coordination amplified the transformation. Ground controllers in England guided groups hundreds of kilometers inside Germany using GEE and oboe navigation aids, maintaining real-time plots of aerial movements. Instead of radioing each squadron, controllers relayed vector corrections to entire formations through coded bursts. American fighters began appearing at precisely the altitudes and bearings where Luftwaffe units were forming to intercept bombers. What the Germans perceived as omniscience was simply data efficiency. Numbers told the story. Between February 20th and 25, the 8th Air Force flew 3,800 fighter sorties. Of these, 2,600 engaged the enemy. Confirmed Luftwaffe losses: 600 aircraft destroyed, hundreds more damaged beyond repair. The ratio of German to American fighter losses reached 3.5 to 1, an inversion of the catastrophic statistics from the previous year. In the 357th Fighter Group, operating from Leiston, daily logs recorded the practical consequences of doctrine. February 22nd, 41 enemy aircraft destroyed. February 23rd, 34 more. February 24th, 58 kills claimed, 6 Mustangs lost. Each column of figures represented not just wrecked machines, but eliminated instructors, squadron leaders, and aces whose experience could not be replaced. Pilots adjusted their language as quickly as they adjusted tactics. No one spoke of escort duty anymore. They referred to fighter sweeps, bounces, and airfield suppressions. Ground attack became standard procedure at the end of each mission. If ammunition remained, returning pilots strafed airfields, locomotives, and convoys. Doolittle called it economy of violence, using every liter of fuel and every bullet before crossing the channel home. The effect on the German command structure was catastrophic. Centralized control had been the Luftwaffe's pride. Now it was its liability. Fuel shortages prevented mass scrambles. When formations did get airborne, they found themselves isolated, picked apart by roaming Mustangs operating far outside radar coverage. The shift from concentrated defense to scattered reaction eroded morale faster than losses themselves. Oberst Hubertus von Bonin, commander of Jagdgeschwader 54, wrote to headquarters in late February. Enemy fighters now dictate the time and place of combat. We have lost the initiative completely. The old tactics are suicide. The new ones we do not yet possess. The statement reached Berlin the same day Doolittle's staff compiled internal analysis, confirming the same conclusion from the opposite perspective. His report to General Arnold read, "Enemy fighter organization shows signs of structural collapse. Our offensive operations have forced them into piecemeal engagements. We are now fighting not a system, but fragments." Meanwhile, the Mustangs themselves continued to evolve. Field modifications improved survivability and endurance. New 110-gallon, 416-liter drop tanks extended range to 2,000 kilometers, allowing deep penetrations to Augsburg and Regensburg. Gyroscopic computing gun sights simplified deflection shooting, turning average pilots into marksmen. With 150-octane fuel, the Merlin engine's war emergency power exceeded 1,700 horsepower, enough to outclimb every German piston aircraft above $7,000 MIM. The discipline of this transformation was as critical as the technology. Each pilot trained to maintain formation integrity even during chaotic combat, knowing that survival depended on mutual awareness rather than visual contact alone. Radio brevity codes standardized communication across squadrons. Tactical frequency lists were updated daily to counter jamming. The entire air fleet had become a single organism, distributed yet coordinated, instinctive yet mechanical. By early March, German intelligence analysts confronted an inescapable pattern. Daily reconnaissance showed Allied fighters over 15 different airfields before noon, sometimes attacking 3 at once. Statistical models predicted that if the loss rate continued, fighter strength in Western Europe would fall below 1,000 aircraft by May. The mathematics of collapse were no longer theoretical. They were visible in burned hangars and empty pilot barracks. The men flying under Doolittle felt the difference. They no longer measured success by how many bombers survived, but by how many interceptors failed to rise. The war in the air had changed from defense of machines to annihilation of men. And in those numbers, thousands of sorties, hundreds of kills, dozens of airfields rendered unusable, the balance of power in Europe shifted irreversibly. Yet even as the statistics mounted, another transformation was unfolding. One less visible to headquarters, but more decisive in outcome. The psychological implosion of a fighter force that had once seemed invincible. The next phase would not be written in sortie logs or fuel tables, but in the diaries of German pilots who realized the sky above the Reich no longer belonged to them. The losses did not merely subtract machines, they unstitched confidence. Reports reached Luftwaffe staff not as numbers, but as changes in tone. Shorter reports, clipped orders, appeals for pilots rather than tactics. What had been bureaucratic certainty dissolved into appeals for restraint. The language of command shifted from maneuvers to survival. Diaries preserved after the war revealed the human fracture. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Meyer, a 109 pilot with more than 400 missions, wrote in March, "We no longer climb with pride, we climb with fear. The sky feels thinner, as if the air itself conspires against us." The entry reads like a weather report for morale. Measured, factual, impossible to misread. Confidence had measurable physics now, altitude abandoned, speed eroded, willingness to engage reduced. Intercepted radio traffic captured a similar descent. Allied signals intelligence recorded terse Luftwaffe directives. Conserve fighters for defense of key production hubs. Avoid dispersal. Do not chase raids into interior without controller clearance. The commands contained panic in their economy. Where once detailed control orchestrated every staffle, now sparse directives betrayed uncertainty and a shrinking operational horizon. Public displays of bravado evaporated. Propaganda organs, which had earlier celebrated the invincibility of German flyers, slowed their tempo. In a March broadcast, a regional station replaced a boastful sortie report with a muted appeal for ground crews, noting aircraft shortages and delayed maintenance schedules. The rhetorical shift mirrored battlefield reality, state narratives bending to the arithmetic of loss. Even elite formations felt the strain. JG-26 and JG-1 sent mounting lists of casualties and missing aces. Staffel commanders, once imperial in voice, began to write pleas for more training weeks and rest for their novice pilots. Letters from frontline mechanics complained of scavenged spares, engines pushed beyond safe limits, and improvisations born of necessity rather than design. Those letters, when funneled up the chain, became engineering reports that read like lamentations. The cumulative psychological effect had strategic consequences. Young pilots who survived a first mission carried home a different sensation than their predecessors, an impression of emptiness where mastery once lived. Fear replaced daring as the dominant emotion. This change manifested in mission logs. Fewer pursuit entries, more aborts attributed to unfavorable odds, and a growing number of pilots reporting spatial disorientation following aggressive American dives. Captured German pilots provided the Allies with testimony that confirmed the change. Unteroffizier Hans R., taken off a field near Kassel, sat across from an American interrogator and said simply, "We thought we were invulnerable. Now we know we are replaceable." The observation was not rhetorical. It was administrative. Pilots recognized their value had plummeted, and with that recognition came a new calculus about risk. Morale bled into recruitment and training. Flight instructors reported students arriving with fewer hours than doctrinal minimums, and with an eroded sense of confidence that could not be fixed with additional simulator time. Training schools, starved for fuel and aircraft, shortened courses. The result was predictable: a steady flow of underprepared replacements into increasingly lethal airspace. The social fabric surrounding the Luftwaffe also shifted. Frontline veterans were previously cultural repositories of tactics and esprit de corps. As their numbers dwindled, institutional memory leaked away. Squadrons found themselves led by officers whose experience was statistical rather than practical. New leaders could not transmit instinctive know-how because their own survival training had been truncated by events. Allied psychological operations amplified the effect. Leaflets dropped over German fields combined factual loss reports with targeted messages about pilot shortages and the futility of pointless engagements. The messaging did not lie. It simply made explicit what crews already suspected. When a pilot read both the daily sortie summary and a leaflet telling him he was expendable, the result was not outrage but resignation. Within the Luftwaffe High Command, debate swelled between reformers and traditionalists. Some urged dispersal of aircraft to secondary fields, camouflage and decentralization to blunt Allied targeting. Others argued for retaking initiative through concentrated counterattacks, a return to centralized doctrine. Each proposal revealed the same flaw. Options existed only within a shrinking envelope of capability. At the operational level, the consequences were visible in three metrics never before so closely watched. Scramble times increased, sortie density per airfield decreased, and experienced pilot presence in formations declined. Commanders who could once assume a cadre of seasoned pilots now faced formations dominated by novices. The intangible loss of mentorship, of quick, tacit corrections delivered in flight, translated into measurable tactical decline. The psychological turning point culminated in a recorded after-action comment from a Jagdgeschwader adjutant. "We no longer fight as a force. We react as individuals." That sentence, terse and forensic, captured the collapse of collective will. A fighting wing that could not act as a coherent instrument had ceded not only the air, but the capacity for organized defense. Doolittle had intended this unraveling. His strategy targeted the pilot corps precisely because numbers alone could not win swiftly enough. He sought to convert mechanical superiority into human collapse. The method had been ruthless and efficient. It operated on morale with the same precision as an engineer calculating thrust. What remained to make the effect permanent, however, was not merely the breaking of will, but the institutional capacity to replace lost competence. The next phase of the conflict would reveal how industrial output, training pipelines, and logistical depth turned tactical success into strategic victory, ensuring that the Luftwaffe's psychological defeat translated into irreversible material collapse. For every German squadron that vanished, an American one seemed to appear in its place. The difference lay not only in factories, but in systems. Behind every Mustang over Germany stood a chain of production, education, and logistics that no Axis nation could equal. The real weapon of Doolittle's strategy was not a machine. It was an industrial civilization calibrated for war. At Willow Run, Michigan, Ford's mile-long assembly lines produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. North American Aviation's plant in Inglewood turned out 15 new Mustangs daily, each arriving by rail at East Coast depots already test-flown and equipped for combat. In January 1944 alone, the United States built 2,400 long-range fighters. Germany, in the same period, completed barely 900 interceptors. The arithmetic of survival was irreversible. But the American advantage extended beyond sheer quantity. The replacement rate for trained pilots was equally relentless. In the United States, 63 flight schools operated under the Army Air Force's Training Command. Each graduated hundreds of aviators every month through standardized syllabi, identical aircraft, and interchangeable parts. Ground crew training mirrored the same principle. Mechanics rotated seamlessly between fighter types because electrical systems, hydraulic fittings, and control layouts were standardized by design. This systemic uniformity allowed Doolittle's air fleets to function like replaceable organs in a living body. Losses, inevitable and heavy, could be absorbed without breaking rhythm. A squadron destroyed one week could be rebuilt the next with new machines and pilots already proficient in the same procedures, radios and tactics. For the Luftwaffe, such elasticity was impossible. By 1944, Allied bombing had crippled Germany's industrial geography. Synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Politz burned under constant attack. The refineries that fed Daimler-Benz and Junkers engines produced only a fraction of the aviation gasoline required. Training hours per pilot dropped from 240 in 1942 to barely 110 by mid-1944. New flyers reached the front without instrument training, without formation practice, sometimes without firing live ammunition. An intercepted German memorandum from April 1944 lamented, "Our aircraft production remains strong in theory, but our pilot production has collapsed in fact." The distinction was fatal. A factory could replace metal, it could not replace mastery. American industry filled the void with brutal efficiency. Chicago's Douglas plant produced wings. Cleveland's Republic facility shipped engines. California's Northrop factory assembled fuselages. Every component fit another because each followed a shared design standard. a triumph of administrative coordination as decisive as any battle. The War Production Board tracked output through punch card systems that projected shortages before they occurred. Logistics ceased being reactive. It became predictive. Doolittle understood this network better than most field commanders. He had spent much of his pre-war life inside it, working as a test pilot and engineer for Shell Oil's aviation division. He knew how to translate laboratory data into field advantage. When reports showed that 150-octane gasoline increased engine life by 40%, he insisted it be distributed exclusively to long-range fighter units. When he learned that ground crews could rearm a Mustang in 17 minutes instead of 40 by reorganizing tool layouts, he ordered the method standardized across the 8th Air Force. Every decision was a multiplication problem. Efficiency measured in German aircraft destroyed per man-hour. Training mirrored the logic of production. At fighter schools in England, instructors drilled replacements not in chivalry, but in procedures. Engage from altitude, fire short bursts, brake by energy retention, climb and reform. Combat footage from gun cameras became teaching films. New pilots watched their predecessors' kills, frame by frame, learning geometry instead of instinct. It was combat turned into curriculum. The contrast to Germany's improvisation was stark. Jagdgeschwader now fielded teenagers with minimal experience, some with fewer than 25 flight hours. The veterans who survived long enough to train them were themselves burned out, flying machines maintained by overworked mechanics scavenging from wrecks. Even the Luftwaffe's famed technical rigor dissolved under shortages. Propeller pitch regulators failed, engines seized, and communication equipment degraded under static interference, once filtered out by specialized parts no longer available. Meanwhile, in America, training attrition was an acceptable cost. One instructor remarked, "We can afford to lose pilots in training. The enemy can't afford to lose them in combat." That cold calculus defined the divide between industrialized warfare and artisanal warfare. By mid-spring, Doolittle's forces could replace a downed Mustang within 10 days and a pilot within 21. For Germany, replacing a pilot required 4 months and an aircraft that might never arrive. Every sortie widened that temporal gap. Every engagement multiplied it. The Luftwaffe still flew bravely, but the fight had shifted beyond courage. It now belonged to logistics, mathematics, and metallurgy, to nations that could outproduce, out-train, and out-plan. By May 1944, Doolittle's offensive no longer depended on inspiration. It ran on process, and as the factories of Detroit, Dallas, and Buffalo sent their mechanical squadrons across the Atlantic, the last illusion of parity vanished. The Luftwaffe's physical depletion was measurable, but its moral exhaustion would soon become absolute. Within weeks, the German Air Force would cease to function as an organized instrument of defense. What remained would be fragments and the beginning of collapse. By June 1944, the collapse had become undeniable. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper. Its order of battle listed hundreds of Gruppen and squadrons. But in the sky, it was a ghost. Radar stations along the North Sea registered fewer and fewer friendly returns each morning. Pilots on watchtowers near Münster looked up at empty airfields where squadrons once launched in perfect synchrony. The destruction was not a single event. It was an accumulation of exhaustion. Each lost pilot meant not just an empty cockpit, but the evaporation of experience, mentorship, and morale. Replacement crews arrived younger and less trained, their instructors dead or wounded. In April 1944, average Luftwaffe flight hours per trainee had dropped below 120. By June, it was 80. Many took off for their first combat missions without ever having fired live ammunition at moving targets. Fuel became the next enemy. The Allied bombing of synthetic oil facilities at Leuna, Boelen, and Brooks reduced aviation fuel output by more than half. Jagdgeschwader 300, one of the Luftwaffe's premier defense units, was grounded for 7 consecutive days due to lack of fuel. Entire airfields operated on rationed reserves, saving gasoline for emergency interception only. When the Allies launched Operation Overlord on June 6th, the Luftwaffe could barely respond. Of the 800 fighters theoretically assigned to the Western Front, fewer than 300 were operational. Fewer than 100 made contact with Allied invasion forces that day. German commanders measured the situation with grim precision. Adolf Galland, general of fighters, wrote in his diary, "We are not defeated in courage, but in numbers, fuel, and time." His staff reports became elegies in statistical form. The Reich's defense grid, once an interlocked system of radar, command, and quick reaction, now functioned as isolated fragments connected by failing radio lines. American analysts reviewing intercepts from the period noted that Luftwaffe response times to bomber formations had slowed from 12 minutes to nearly 40. Radar control centers that once coordinated entire regions now managed only scattered patrols. Doolittle's decision to destroy fighters on the ground had proven decisive. More than 100 German aircraft were destroyed on airfields between March and June 1944 alone. By mid-June, the impact reached the front lines. The 8th Air Force now flew deep strikes without serious opposition. Escort losses dropped to single digits per mission. The P-51s roamed above German territory unchallenged, attacking trains, fuel convoys, and airfields at will. Railroad junctions at Ham, Kassel, and Fulda burned continuously, paralyzing troop movements toward France. The Luftwaffe's once feared night fighters, starved of fuel and radar components, could no longer intercept even unescorted Pathfinder squadrons. The statistics tell the precision of ruin. February 1944. 1,700 operational Luftwaffe fighters in the West. June 1944. 450. Pilot replacements, 15,000 trained in 1942, fewer than 3,000 by summer 1944. Average pilot lifespan at the front, 17 days. The psychological echo reached civilians. Across Germany, the sound of engines overhead no longer inspired hope of defense, but signaled inevitable bombing. Cities burned without resistance. Even propaganda shifted. The Völkischer Beobachter stopped publishing daily victory claims. Instead, it praised heroic endurance and faith under air attack, coded acknowledgments of helplessness. In captured German documents, one order dated July 1, 1944, read, "The Luftwaffe remains the shield of the Reich. Every flight is a victory." The sentence, designed to inspire, instead read like confession. Inside Doolittle's headquarters, analysts recognized the transition. Fighter commands ceased speaking of destroying the Luftwaffe. They began using the phrase air supremacy achieved. It was no longer a duel of equals, but a process of dismantling. By late summer, even experienced German aces faced mathematical extinction. One by one, the surviving units, JG-2, JG-26, JG-300, were withdrawn to reconstitute, leaving the skies undefended. In their place rose the last desperate experiment, the Me-262 jet, brilliant in concept, but too late, too few, too fuel-starved to matter. When American and British ground forces crossed the Seine in August, the Luftwaffe could offer no cover, no reconnaissance, no interference. The once proud shield of the Reich had vanished, replaced by silence and smoke. For Doolittle's pilots, the shift was palpable. Missions that had once been duels became executions. The thrill of combat gave way to something colder, professional precision, an industrial rhythm of attack and return. The victory he had engineered was total, but it carried no exultation. And as the summer of 1944 faded into autumn, Doolittle's madness had become orthodoxy. The strategy once deemed reckless was now the foundation of air power itself, proof that audacity, when coupled with system, could destroy even the most disciplined enemy. The war in the air was effectively over. What remained was the reckoning, how history would interpret a victory born not of chance or courage, but of calculated destruction. In the months that followed, silence replaced defiance in the skies over Europe. By September 1944, Luftwaffe activity had fallen to less than 10 sorties per day in sectors that once saw hundreds. Radar screens in England, once alive with enemy signals, displayed only scattered echoes, metallic debris, lost weather balloons, the ghosts of a defeated air force. The Reich's last attempt at resurgence came with the Me-262, the first operational jet fighter. It was fast, ingenious, terrifying in short bursts, but it arrived into an ecosystem already dead. There was no fuel, no spare parts, and no veteran corps to fly it. In the aftermath, the Allied air forces achieved what no military in history had accomplished: total, uncontested command of the atmosphere. The air above Germany had become an Allied highway, and below it, the Reich itself was being dismantled piece by piece. For Doolittle, the vindication was both technical and philosophical. When he had taken command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, his peers whispered that he was reckless, a man guided by instinct more than reason, a showman with a penchant for risk. By the end of the year, those same voices described him in another way, as the architect of modern aerial warfare. He never sought that title. To those who served under him, Doolittle was a presence defined by restraint rather than theater. His post-mission debriefs were calm, mathematical, almost detached. "We destroyed their ability to fight," he told his staff in late 1944, "because we understood what war really is, a contest of systems, not heroes." The numbers confirmed it. From February to June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 3,000 fighters and 2,500 trained pilots. In the same period, American production replaced every loss 3 times over. The ratio of fuel consumption between the two air forces, once roughly balanced, had shifted to 6.1 in America's favor. By year's end, the Luftwaffe could field barely 200 operational aircraft in the West, a fraction of the swarm that had once dominated Europe. Historians later debated what Doolittle's transformation truly represented. Some argued it was the triumph of technology, others of logistics, still others of psychology, the weaponization of fear through relentless pursuit. But those who served understood it differently. It was a shift from chivalric air combat to systemic warfare, from duels between men to the destruction of entire infrastructures. Colonel Don Blakesley, one of Doolittle's most trusted fighter leaders, described it simply: "We stopped playing their game, we stopped fighting pilots, and started killing an air force." The phrase captured the essence of the revolution Doolittle had engineered. Before him, air combat had been measured by sorties, by tactical victories, by gallantry. After him, it was measured by networks, by flow, by the enemy's inability to generate force. Modern doctrine, air superiority, then air supremacy, was born in those months when the mad general turned chaos into control. His approach reshaped the post-war world. The newly created U.S. Air Force in 1947 institutionalized his philosophy: command of the air as a prerequisite for all other forms of combat. Every conflict that followed, from Korea to Vietnam, from Desert Storm to the 21st century, followed the same chain of logic. Seek the enemy's network, break its cohesion, destroy its capacity to think or react. The weapon was not flight, but control. The psychological residue endured longest in Germany. Post-war interviews with surviving Luftwaffe officers often returned to the same moment, the winter and spring of 1944, when they realized the air had turned against them. General Adolf Galland, who had fought Doolittle's forces directly, later told an American historian, "He won not by killing us, but by making us irrelevant." In that irrelevance lay the true meaning of Doolittle's victory. His strategy did not merely defeat the Luftwaffe. It erased the concept of air parity itself. From then onward, air superiority would no longer be a temporary condition, but an expectation, a fundamental assumption of modern war. And yet, Doolittle himself remained uneasy with glory. After the war, he returned to civilian life quietly, declining promotion, resisting politics. When asked by a journalist in 1946 whether he considered his strategy ruthless, he paused and answered with characteristic precision, "War is not about fairness. It's about who stops fighting first. My duty was to make sure it wasn't us." The remark summarized both the man and his method. His gamble had cost thousands of lives, but it had shortened the war and redefined its logic. The Luftwaffe had entered 1944 as the world's most experienced air force. It ended that year as a cautionary study in how speed, innovation, and morale could be broken not by courage, but by comprehension. In the frozen skies above Germany, where contrails once braided across the clouds like scars, a new form of warfare had been born. It was not noble, not romantic, and not forgiving, but it was precise, industrial, and absolute. From that precision came a truth that would shape every sky thereafter. Control of the air was no longer a means to victory. It was victory itself.